this for a while. This is a very good story. Once there was a young man and woman who fell in love and got married in old India. And the young man was from a village far away, and it was custom in their province that the wife would go live in the husband's home. They were really happy, except that the wife really missed her family very, very much. In fact, they had a really strong family unit. They had, by this time, a little toddler, a little boy, and she was pregnant, and everything was going really well for them, except that she was so lonely for her family. So she asked her husband over and over again, and he finally agreed that they would take this trip to see her family. And even though it was during the monsoon season and the roads would be muddy and stuff, but they decided to go. So they traveled a long time, and they rested wherever they could find shelter. And one night they had no place to stay, so they slept on the side of they went off the road a little bit and slept in some grasses. And in the night, the young husband was bitten by a poisonous snake, and he died instantly. Well, you can imagine how the young wife felt, totally alone with a toddler and expecting a child, and just losing her husband, who she loved with all her heart. So she sat there, and they had really come so far, and she was so distraught that she decided it was better to keep going towards her family's home instead of turn around and try to go back to her husband's family. So they continued their journey. This grief-stricken young wife that was very pregnant with her little son. And after a few days of them traveling, because of the stress, she began to go into labor. So she found a spot to lie down on, off the side of the road, and with her toddler sitting beside her, she gave birth to this new baby. So the weather was wet and was rainy, and she wrapped her newborn in her sari and held her close to her body for warmth. And they got up and continued walking towards their family's home. And in time they came to a river. And since it was the monsoon season, the river was high, and it was flowing very rapidly, and it was very deep. But it was that way as far as she could see in either direction. So she knew that she had to figure out how to cross there. So she thought about it. She really looked. She really thought about it. So she took her toddler, and she took him on the side of the river they were, and she took him high up, as far away from the river as possible on the bank. And she set him there, and she told him as explicitly as she could to a toddler that what Mommy was going to do. Mommy was going to take the baby across the river, and then she would be back for him, and he needed to sit right there and not move. Stay right there. And she asked him if he understood. And he said he understood, so she set him down. She picked up the baby, and she held it as high as she could as she started to go across the river. And it was very treacherous, and she really had to keep her footing because the current was so strong. She looked back, and her toddler was still sitting there. She got across the river, took the baby high up on the bank. She laid the baby down safely. And then she went back to the river's edge, and she started back over to get her toddler. And she was about halfway when her toddler saw her coming, and he got up and started walking towards the river. And she was motioning to him to stay. And because of the current of the sound, he couldn't hear her. But she was telling him to stay, but he thought she was calling him to come to her. So he came up to the edge of the river, and she's telling him to stop, and he's thinking she wants him to come to her. And he steps close enough to the water that the current grabs him and sweeps him away. And she screams in horror, wondering what to do, but she can't even see him anymore. So in her horror and panic, she turns around to go back to the other side to her baby. And as she turns around and heads to the side where the baby is, she sees a big bird fly down and scoop the baby up and fly away with it. So she's standing in the middle of the river, horrified, and something in her breaks in her grief for what she just experienced. And she goes numb, but she keeps walking out of the river and keeps going towards her family. And it took her many days to get to her family's village. And she went down the street to where her family's house was. And the house was not there. And she asked the neighbors where her family was. And they said they were so sorry to tell her that the house burned down and everybody in the family died in the fire. Something again in her broke. And from that day on, she walked through the village and the countryside, really half naked. Her clothes became rags. She ate garbage, anything she could find. And people watched her, and there wasn't anything they could do for her. She just walked around half naked and not really conscious. And one day, there was some people that were walking in the countryside into a forest setting, and she just followed them. She just started walking with them. And she came to this clearing, and there was a gathering sitting around a teacher who was teaching. And she walked up to the teacher, and she felt who knows what. And he looked at her, and she knelt down, and she started telling him her whole story. That she had a husband that she loved, and she was pregnant, and she had this toddler, and they went on this journey, and her husband died from the snake bite, and then her son was swept away and drowned in the river, and her baby was taken from this bird, and the whole thing. And when she was finished, the teacher, who was Lord Buddha, looked at her with great compassion and said, "What has that got to do with you?" And in that moment, she cracked open and she had an awakening and she was healed. And she went about creating a life for herself. She became one of his greatest